When did seizing people's countries to make empires become unacceptable at an international level?
There's a very interesting moment, I think, where you find a revulsion over this, and I think it is the invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia as it then was, by the Italians in the mid-1930s. And that was done with such brutality, such extraordinary brutality, that one finds a very, very widespread revulsion expressed in the League of Nations. It's a powerless, it's an impotent kind of objection. And nothing is done to Italy to punish it, to stop it doing it. The League of Nations is very like the United Nations in terms of its relative impotence. But by the time the United Nations Charter is being drawn up in the course of the Second World War, you find a pretty strong anti-colonial strain in a lot of its documentation. And I think that's led by the strong feelings of the United States of America of an anti-colonial sort, which I think are sold by American liberals, that those sentiments are sold by American liberals as a remnant of the great resistance to British colonial power in the 1770s, but actually have very much more to do with the maintenance of American economic hegemony. Colonialism clearly stood in the way of the expansion of American markets. American markets and American productive capacity had increased enormously in the course of the Second World War, and colonies, burgeoning economies in the colonies were clearly potential markets, but difficult markets, so long as colonialism persisted, as some colonial powers had imperial preference and kept foreigner competition out of those markets. So the anti-colonialism begins, I think, with American distaste for imperialism, although of course it's an imperial power in very many ways, particularly in places like the Philippines. But it's also a distaste that increasingly gets picked up by the growing number of what we used to call third world states that become members of the United Nations, led obviously by India, and that's hugely important after 1947. But a gradual increase in the number of ex-colonial states that are themselves explicitly and implicitly anti-colonial. That includes very much of Latin America, India, Southeast Asia, and so on. So
by things like the non-aligned movement.
Absolutely right. The Bandung Conference is of huge significance, where large numbers of people declare themselves anti-imperial. And they do that with the tacit support, which actually is much more verbal than it was actually material support of the Soviet Union and of China. So it's a big anti-colonial movement. But I think there's a domestic metropolitan aversion to colonialism, and that is very visible, I think, more visible in the case of Britain than in France simply because we have the documentation. That there was a recognition that if you were to avoid colonial war after 1945, that basically the only way to avoid that kind of huge expenditure in terms of life, but also in terms of money, was to pacify people by means of giving them something that they demanded, and what they demanded was, of course, the extension of something very like the welfare state. And that was deemed to be unaffordable in a colonial context, and consequently the notion of cutting and running, of leaving colonies behind to provide for their own self-financed state structures, their own self-financed bureaucracies, education systems, health services and so on, becomes a much more current view by the mid-1950s in Britain.
So it was the cost that made people throw in the towel, as it were?
That would very much my analysis.
Yeah, the raised expectations of nationalism, certainly the moderate, inverted commas, nationalism.
That the only way of facing that down, other than the horrible use of force, and Kenya and of course particularly Algeria were horrible examples of both the cost and the horror of it and the embarrassment of it in international circles. The only way around that was in effect buying a way out, and there simply wasn't enough cash in the bank to buy out.
What does the African experience have to say about other imperial experiences like the Russian/Soviet Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish Empire? How do those things relate?
Marxists would say that there's a very real difference between the late imperialism that occurs in Africa, and I think it's worth pointing out that Africa resists imperial occupation until very late in the day, Africa falls into being colonies right at the end of the 19th century, and in some cases never really did. One of the striking things about Somalia, for example, is that people drew lines on maps and said this splits Italian, this splits French, this splits British, and so on. But it was never ever really colonised and never really subject to colonial overrule. That colonial overrule was resisted strongly throughout the colonial existence of that state. But it's a different kind of colonialism than the earlier kind of imperial expansions of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And that is argued by quite a lot of people, not just Marxists, on the grounds that these are modern states that are doing the colonising. They're modern metropolitan states with railways, with sophisticated banking systems, with steam transport, with
communication systems.
And communication systems. But they're also states which are based on very expansive economies that simply cannot survive on the basis of limited markets. And the market becomes the key variable, the most important part of late 19th century imperialism, the control of the market, in some cases the ownership of the market, the control of what vast numbers of people in these colonial territories can buy and can sell, and the use of the product of those colonial states in order to cheapen the raw material costs of production, but also to keep things within monetary systems, the sterling area, the franc zone, and so on. And in that sense, there's a complexity to late 19th century imperialism, which I think is lacking in the more obvious sort of conquest state circumstance. In terms of the comparison with the Ottoman Empire, of course, the differences are many and various in that there is a much more powerful skein of cultural imperialism that is implicit in Ottoman expansion, particularly where Ottoman expansion occurs in non-Islamic areas, and that's very pertinent. There's also, of course, what one might argue, a greater degree of cultural tolerance in Ottoman expansion, in terms of its permission to people to be different, although it taxed them very heavily for being different. In that sense, there are very substantial differences within various periods of imperialism. But late 19th century imperialism has a force to it, and a combination of both its financial force and, of course, its physical force, which are unprecedented in terms of world history.
Richard, thanks for talking to me today.